It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you some of my most recent work. What I'm going to present are fragments, are drafts for a book that I'm now writing to be titled Dump Philosophy. And so I want to think about this idea of the global dump as the name for contemporary ontology in its various manifestations, from the environmental to the corporeal, to the psychic, to the political, to the dump that we're creating even at the level of knowledge. So what I will do in the beginning of the talk is I'm going to set the stage, so to speak, and say what exactly I mean by this quasi-concept. It's not exactly a concept. I call it a trash can term. It's a kind of, yes. And so I will outline very briefly outline three defining features of what I call the global dump, and then from there start thinking about the mutation of life and matter into this strange concept of biomass in relation to our digital existences on Twitter as well, and so on. This is just to give you a preview of what's to come. But first, this general introduction to the idea of the dump. Ours is the age of the global dump, and the information without form that sometimes lends a name to post-industrial societies, economies, and ways of crafting knowledge is but a single trait in its portrait, the still or already unframed world picture. We live and die on a dump of ideas, bodies, dreams, materials, snippets of relations, sound bites and memes, decontextualized and dehistoricized, generated as waste, already generated as waste, not just wasted afterwards, but already generated as waste, clipped, isolated and thrown together in a massive jumble in the wake of what used to be a world. And maybe in a wonderful city like Geneva, it might sound like an exaggeration, but believe me, even here in Geneva, we live and die on the dump. What do the words "we live" comprehend? How to apprehend them without arresting their referent? What does it mean to say "we live"? According to the preeminent ancient sensibility, these words mean we animate and are animated, we move and are moved. In the modern paradigm, they are likely to convey that we produce and are produced, that we produce and reproduce ourselves. Living on a dump, we are moved, produced, and reproduced by the dump as by ourselves. For the most part, and while technically alive, we are dying there, dismembered, thrown out, trashed, alienated even from our alienation, coming to love it, this alienation, or altogether indifferent, anesthetized with pharmaceutically and ideologically manufactured painkillers. The dump lives for us. It takes over the movement, production, and reproduction of world destruction, wrecking the very being world of the world. And so, as I promised, I'm going to outline what I see as the three main features of the dump and contemplate with you what happens to life and to living in the age of global dumping. But so these are the three features. The first one is the falling. Dumping is causing the fall. In Old Norse, dumpe means to fall suddenly to the ground or into water, to plump. Onomatopoeic, the word falls on the ear with the explosive, or more accurately with the plosive sound of the consonants d, detonated on the tongue, and p, flying of the lips. It begins and ends by abruptly stopping the airflow and blocking the vocal tract, dump, right? Which is to say that it begins and ends in suffocation, of speech above all. As soon as we pronounce it, the dump takes our breath away and robs us of words, of the voice, of articulation, the bread and butter of philosophers enamored of logos, and we touched upon this in the seminar earlier today. While suspending breathing that beyond an exchange of gases between an organism and the atmosphere signifies life in the embodied spirit, the dump instigates the very fall, the culmination of which it marks. It reunites falling and fallenness, right? Because we can think about the verb to dump and a dump, the noun, right? So it unites these substantive and verbal dimensions of the word. In the former verbal modality, the unanticipated and violent force inherent to this act favors the connotations of making fall over letting fall. To dump is not just to gently let something fall, it's really to make fall. Instead of delivering beings to their fate, dumping hastens their fall, speeds up their ruination, quickly drops them into non-being. It does so by way of getting rid of them, throwing them out, making them fall away. So it's a kind of wasting away, a fall that wastes. But from what or from whom does the fall fall? We circle back to this question behind a venerable theological tradition that frames sin within the dynamics of the fall. We know that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the fall is sinfulness itself. And this kind of a tradition is further enhanced with the Gnostic derision of the body. The body is already fallen, right? Flesh as the fallen. The entire history of metaphysics is that of spirit trashing matter, right? In Western metaphysics, spirit is what dumps matter, right? It trashes matter and thinks that matter is nothing but a dump. But actually, the fall of matter precipitates spirit as that from which the fallen has fallen. Spirit, as I imagine it, is a sublime dump truck, tirelessly offloading beings into non-being, emptying being out en masse, and transforming the metaphysical equivalent of gravitational potential, into kinetic energy. Right? So by the simple movement of falling, we know in physics there is energy generated, kinetic energy from potential gravitational energy. The same thing happens in metaphysics when matter is dumped by spirit. It comes into its own and coincides with its concept, this sublime dump truck, when its bed is vacant, having released its great accumulated mass. But it also comes to its ruin. Carrying no matter, the dump truck of spirit buckles under its own weightlessness, as it turns out that the volume of its gigantic bed had been generated by the load it dropped. So the first feature was the fall. The second feature of the dump, or of to dump, is massiveness. It is not just any fall, it is a falling en masse, massiveness. The dumped falls both suddenly and massively, in great quantities and in a shapeless shape of mass. Dumped matter is heaviness, a quality automatically transcribed into quantity that pulls existence down to earth. Right? So this massiveness means both huge numbers, great quantities, but also mass as a shapeless kind of conglomeration, without a form of its own. Mass is matter in bulk and unbearably light, the gravity of weight and the ideality of number, huge numbers and heaviness. Right? You will encounter no determinate material entities in it. The mass of the massive throw is not that of an object, it is mass as such. So it is the mass, undifferentiated mass as such that falls here. In the gargantuan, in the huge outpouring of dumped existence, the principle of deindividuation is beyond dispute. And here we're already touching on biomass, on the mass part of biomass, right? Just as perhaps obliquely we touched upon the bios, the life, in the very beginning of these remarks. But we will get back to all of this, of course. So it is the dumping of mass as such, without any individuation of the entities that fall. Whatever entity the scholastic quadlibet ends falls alongside countless others, human or not, and is indistinguishable from them in falling precisely in the capacity of the generic whatever. Right? It doesn't matter who or what you are, or which parts of you and others, and whether human or not, are commingled in this massive fall. The dumped one is immediately the many, not in a company with them, but as a consequence of their and our common massification. Right? So there is in this dump ontology a common massification, a transformation of everything and everyone into a huge mass that is ready to be dropped. The sinner's fallen body is a sentient and anonymous mass, fleshy matter bereft of form, a memento mori flashing in its non-individuation, a snapshot of the corpse it will have become. Judeo-Christian flesh must submit to the grueling routines of disciplining, punishment, and mortification to obtain a semblance of form. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, flesh is this formless mass already. In order to achieve form, it has to be disciplined, punished, mortified. And we learned this from Michel Foucault, among others, but certainly from him as well. With the soul and its formative influence out of the secular picture, flesh follows suit and vanishes. Living corporeality mutates into biomass, the subject of today's talk, expandable organic matter burnt to derive energy as a stand-in for spirit. For the massiveness of dumping is its energy. The more matter falls, the faster, the harder, the bigger the pyre, the more force its impact and combustion provide. So there is a fall and burning. We will talk also about the directionality of the fall, because with the law of gravity, we know that things fall downwards. But what we are doing is that we're throwing huge amounts of the earth in the shape of combusted biofuels, of combusted fossil fuels as well. We're dumping those into the sky, so that the very sense of what is up and down is itself disturbed in this dumping of matter down and up at the same time. The heap of shapeless stuff that stays behind, the dump in the state of rest, and ill-shapen piece, as per the word's alternative etymology, is the byproduct of these past activities. And so now the third feature of the dump is piling up. Piling up. So we had the fall, massiveness, and now piling up. The dump that the earth, the sky, and everything in between have become is a peculiar, internally disarticulated, disorganized, discombobulated totality, nearly identical to infinity. Sweeping all that is into their midst, the sprawling piles of stuff neither gather nor articulate the fragments of bodies, ideas, materials, and information they contain. These adjoin one another at random. There is no necessary order. There is no, you can't really find any order in the piling up of the dumped. They join one another at random, with no rhyme or reason, with no logos, with no width, commemorating how by fluke they have been thrown out together. And so a comprehensive definition of the dump would be a massive, undifferentiated, and indifferent fall. This is how I define it. The dump is a massive, undifferentiated, and indifferent fall from which our so-called our age receives its identity and its difference. We may applaud the promise of freedom in the dump's disorder, an opportunity for liberation from the stuffiness and stiffness of past teleologies, and the refreshing anarchy of the melange. And this has been happening in various corners of contemporary thought as well. This kind of celebration of the dump, right, as a final liberation from teleology, from logos, and so forth. We may applaud all of this. True, the totality of the dump falls down and falls apart, staving off an organic, organicist, fascist variety of totalitarianism. Its indifference, however, is so radical, so thoroughgoing, that it lies on the hither side of sameness and difference, yet another staple metaphysical dichotomy leveled. As its piles grow, they choke off being and clog every modality of time, including the past. The dump's quantitative increase is unlike vegetal flourishing from the inside out. And we were talking also earlier today about the meaning of growth, because in modernity we come to think about growth as a quantitative increase, more of the same, and we forget the qualitative dimension of growth, which leads to metamorphosis, change, a qualitative change. And so the pile that grows is of course growing only quantitatively, but nothing really changes qualitatively here. Unless the debris is swept up by a storm, it grows by accretion, less regular still than that of a mineral. An actual nightmare stems from the daydream of metaphysics and of capitalist economy. Monstrous growth without decay in a dissociation between two of the movements emblematic of Aristotle's vegetality. Their uncoupling jams the third mode of movement, which I've just mentioned, metamorphosis, change of shape. Such an imitation of fuses of nature is incontrovertibly partial, shoddy, and deficient. The pile piles up indefinitely. As the maniac activity of dumping massifies the fall, the fallen bits, for the most part, do not rot, and not rotting, accumulate. The nastiest sectors of our dump do not stink and are resistant to decomposition. Right? And so I call it a little cryptically the death of death. This is the death of death that irreparably damages life. The dumped leftovers from our mad aspirations to incorruptibility, to static preservation, interfering with the vitality and its, of the world and its narrow parameters. We perish of our perversely realized yearnings for immortality. Right? When we want the Platonic dream of this immutable, unchangeable being, right? When we realize it in, let's say, nuclear energy and its byproducts that take hundreds, thousands of years to decompose, as it were, or when we fill the world with plastic that takes 450 years to decompose, we are perversely producing the objective proofs, as it were, of our yearnings for atemporal being, and we perish of our perversely realized yearnings for immortality that drag much of the biosphere down with us. So now that this very brief outline of the dump is within view, let me begin or re-begin again from afar and talk about this notion of biomass, which I think needs to be theorized and thought through critically as a kind of double clue to what happens to both life and matter today, right? Life as the bio component of it and mass as what matter has become. On January 7th, 2015, gunmen shot and killed 12 people in the Paris headquarters of the satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo. Immediately after the attack, the slogan, "Je suis Charlie," popped up on Twitter, a brainchild of Joachim Consant, the artistic director and journalist for Stylist magazine. A trending online hashtag and a banner in demonstrations in support of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, the statement promptly gained currency around the world. So when I titled the talk, "Je suis biomasse," I'm obviously alluding to this hashtag / political banner. At first glance, the dump is anathema to Je suis Charlie. The proclamation is an expression of empathy with the victims, with the institution, and the idea that they represented. Apparently complete, the identification with Charlie exhausts the identifying I. I am Charlie. Nonetheless, the digital dump imposes its own set of rules, and today I am Charlie, while tomorrow I am someone else altogether with the same intensity and conviction. Je suis Charlie is a particular act of identification that dismantles its particularity and unravels the work of identifying with the other, even as it sneers at the prospects of creating a more universal kind of identification. It invites an abstraction, a formal and formulaic identity. Je suis X. And in fact, this is what happens on the digital dump that we also, in a way, inhabit. A generic variable, X, determines what I am at the moment in a wholly indeterminate way, ever ready to change without really becoming, to change into another thing. Transcribing Je suis Charlie into anything is a no-brainer. It has no form adequate to it, and therefore I have no form. Right? The statement of identification has no proper form, and therefore the identifying I has no form as well. Je suis X, therefore je suis Ahmed, je suis Nigeria, Nisman, Boris Nemtsov, Paris, Daphne. In a sum, I am a dump of identifications. And I just went through some of the more memorable hashtags that followed that formula. Now, as you obviously know, the French je suis is a highly unstable locution. It is plurivocal. It has more than one meaning. And Jacques Derrida makes a big deal out of the fact that it can mean I am or I follow, depending on whether we spot in the present tense, in this expression, the present tense of être, to be, or of suis, to follow, in the first person singular. Right? Already the expression I am X fractures the unity of the subject and the predicate it pulls together. Their articulation requires time, at minimum the time needed to say or to write this. It cleaves the I-X unit by squeezing M into it. This very M, I am, suis, is already a cleaving of the identification. And it testifies to the crumbling of the conditions under which it goes without saying who or what I am. If I have to say I am something or someone, that means it doesn't go without saying. Right? There is a problem there. As soon as we settle on the verb suivre, a spatio-temporal fracture between me and that which, or the one whom I follow, widens. This development is ominous, above all at a time when following and unfollowing someone is accomplished with a single, simple click of a button on Twitter, the medium of Je suis Charlie. Why? Because it is necessary to know how to follow others so as to emancipate oneself from this somewhat subservient relation. And yet, digital following precludes the active component, as we're drawn along by whatever is trending at the moment. The more we practically follow others, the less we know how to follow or what following even means. Whoever or whatever it is we follow in this obsequious manner leads us directly to the dump. An honest identification, I think, an honest identification at the current historical juncture is not one that insists on the singularity of the ethical bond to the other, that is, on the impossibility of truly identifying with or following her alterity. Nor does it hinge on a fluctuating, trending cause which should be followed with a semblance of intense passion and profound empathy, only to be abandoned the moment after. So this very honest identification today is neither singular nor this moving along with a trend. Rather, a brutally honest identification would be consciously, explicitly, purposefully deindividuating, mindful of its own dumpiness, of the dump, not for the dump. Hints of transcendence glisten in the genitive of, operative in immanence. The point in cultivating the identification of the dump is to embody and then think the dump from within, so as to break its spell. There is no way out of it, I think, simply by saying I'm at a distance from it. We have to embody and then think it from within so that we could break its spell, perhaps. Isn't discerning the dump, and therefore discerning what prohibits discernment, the only way to peer out of it? Now, this context provides fecund ground for a reflection on another, more recent and more raw as well, hashtag turned political campaign, Me Too, right? Me Too. And I think we have to really think about the materiality of these expressions, because they are so pervasive. They are these sound bites in our environment that we no longer even think what they mean. What do they exactly mean? We no longer ask that. And this might be a good exercise. The denunciation and punishment of sexual harassment, assault, and rape under the banner of the Me Too campaign are, of course, long overdue. There is no doubt that this should have happened a long time ago. Yet the crucial question is not so much what is going on, as in what way is such a watershed event auguring a revolution in cultural perceptions taking place? How is it happening? The identification that says Me Too is evidently not singular. It's generalization peculiar, to say the least. If too combines multiple victims of rape, assault, and harassment, it does so by accretion, piling up polymorphous experiences in an undifferentiated whole. And in fact, various commentators have pointed out that the degrees of severity in the gamut of sexual misconduct tend to become blurred when illuminated by the Me Too movement. Unexamined, the problematic of following we have glimpsed just now hounds us at every turn and hounds also the movement's formation and growth. The political subjectivity emerging from Me Too is as blurry as the demarcation lines between unwanted sexual advances and forced sex. Passive identification with the amorphous other, who is also, like me, a victim, repeats the passivity of having been victimized by an equally amorphous other who is a perpetrator. Right? So there is a kind of dump of identifications created here. The apparatus of Me Too identification does not address the need to work through victimization, rather than letting oneself be engulfed by it. After all, the political quandary proper is how to transition from me to I and then to we. Right? This to me is the problem of politics. How to transition from me to I, and there's a big difference between these, as we'll see, and then to we. Me is a weird personal pronoun. On the one hand, it corners the subject into an object. Me is a target of the behavior of others, right? The subject becomes an object as me, right? In this case, of sexual harassment and kindred types of behavior, as well as an object for dumping into a pile where others are too. On the other hand, it is the pinnacle of a narcissistic attitude, and of melancholy narcissism in particular. A narcissist is paradoxically incapable of saying I. It is always me, me, me. The world revolves around me, and to retain its relevance, has to, in one way or another, act upon me, who does not stand as an I in relation to it. So the first step is to, before even forging solidarity and ties to others, the first step is to forge a relation to oneself and to move from me to I. Any political campaign feeding off and fostering such a narcissistically reactive stance is bound to run into a dead end. Succinctly put then, Me Too is an instance of a deindividuating identification. There is no individuation because there is no movement to the I from the me. And it's an identification because one says too, right? Me too. Albeit not of a consciously embraced variety. It replicates the main traits of the dump, the sheer massiveness of accusations, the rapid drop, also en masse, of the accused, whose fall, bursting with religious connotations, is supposed to elevate the victims to moral heights. The undifferentiated piling up of bodies, the violated and the perpetrators whose careers have been abruptly terminated. The movement's revolutionary potential is therefore overshadowed by sliding into the dump, by its being of and for the dump, not only of, but also for the dump. And here, I would like to make a transition to this quasi-concept of biomass with the help of Walt Whitman and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which I think is a good antidote, a good literary antidote to Je suis Charlie, if not to the unresolved contradictions of Me Too, of the #MeToo movement. The hymn, Whitman's hymn, is the self-consciousness of the dump, putting opposite qualities on the same footing. Let me give you an example. I quote from Whitman. I am of old and young, of the foolish as much as the wise, regardless of others, ever regardful of others, maternal as well as paternal, a child as well as a man, stuffed with the stuff that is coarse and stuffed with the stuff that is fine. End quote. To the formula I am X, Whitman prefers I am of X. And this of, I think, is very important. That's what I was trying to point to by saying that it already has this glimmer of transcendence. Of the old and young, of the foolish as much as the wise, makes me both into less than each group of which I am a part, and into more than the whole I belong to, because of the open-ended chain of other belongings. Right? So I'm both less than those I identify with, and more than each of these groups combined. The preposition of checks the totalizing power of identification. Resembling an incantation, there is a kind of incantation rhythm to the hymn, to the poem. The poem stockpiles disparate determinations of X and of Y. This of Y habitually thought of as not X, neither conserving their schisms nor forging higher syntheses out of them. I am, Whitman circuitously suggests, a dump of the most diverse qualities, plus the cognizance of their amassing, right? And this is a crucial point, right? I am a dump and I realize that I am so, plus the cognizance of their amassing. The conjunctives and as well as much as, concoct out of me a complexio oppositorum, an alchemical and, according to Carl Schmitt, a theologico-political dump. This term is also very important to another Swiss thinker, Carl Jung, who thinks that personality is a kind of complexio oppositorum of different figures or archetypes, right? These polar opposites that are brought together without any mediation immediately. The complexio oppositorum, compiles opposites immediately. It is not dialectical. It just brings these contrasting extremes together immediately, without mediations and without delay. Although a lag between them necessarily persists, if only as a result of interposing a conjunctive, such a collation of opposites discloses a truth that takes some time to unspool in Je suis Charlie. The truth of the statement is its negation. Je suis Charlie, its truth is je ne suis pas Charlie. I am not, or I do not follow Charlie, right? Walt Whitman cuts to the chase and puts the two together at the same time, instead of taking time to reach that conclusion. And then an exceptionally helpful indication, as I see it, is one that Whitman gives his readers in the in one line that I have already read. And this indication is germane to our understanding of matter, to the materiality of who or what I am. And let me remind you of this line: stuffed with the stuff that is coarse and stuffed with the stuff that is fine, which means I am mass, the coarse stuff, and life, the fine stuff. Okay? To paraphrase, I am biomass, a heaviness heaving with life, thrown as a shapeless lump into death-bearing energy production. I am a pound of flesh, or 140 pounds of it. Right? So complete deindividuation. We have to understand that it is not only the beings that we usually think of under the heading of biomass that have these characteristics. We are all, in that sense, biomass. And I am biomass. I start with I in order to move first from me to I, and then perhaps we can all say we are biomass. Je suis biomasse is a deindividuating, anonymous identification alive to the precarious situation of a living death on a global dump. But let's backtrack for a moment and ask, how is this word biomass usually deployed? What does it usually mean? Biomass is primarily vegetal. It refers to wood and crops, corn, sugarcane, as well as alcohol-based biofuels, ethanol derived from plants. But along with vegetation and on par with it, the term comprehends organic garbage and landfill gases such as methane, animal manure, and human sewage. What these diverse components have in common is that, like conventional fossil fuels, they are expected to burn so as to supply energy. But unlike fossil fuels, they are classified as renewable resources, springing forth from a limitless stockpile. Right? So there is an end in sight for fossil fuels, but there is presumably no end in sight for plants, manure, human sewage, garbage, and so on. But all of them are to be burned in order to produce energy. There will always be more plants, municipal waste, and excrement where these came from. Is their affinity to the self-renewing nutritive function of life a good enough justification for massively and indiscriminately dumping the residues of their conflagration into the atmosphere? After all, the resulting CO2 emissions often quantitatively surpass the consequences of burning fossil fuels. When we burn biomass, we're not being more environmentally friendly. In fact, we're releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere quantitatively. The biomass portion of renewable energy warps the very concept of renewability into infinite dumpability. To my mind, renewable energy is meaningless as a term if we put together biomass with wind, solar, hydro, and geothermic power. Because on the one hand, with biomass, we have this worldwide conflagration, this worldwide blaze of energy that is burning everything, including the possibility of the future. And on the other hand, with wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal energy, we have a synergy of humans learning to work together with the elements as opposed to against them. A little bit like plants also work with the elements and not against them in order to achieve their goals. The ingredients of biomass demonstrate with crystal clarity that on a dump, plant life is no different from garbage. Right? Just including all of these things in the same category, it means that plant life on the global dump is no different from garbage and shit. Lest we have the impression that vegetation is alone in this predicament, we should take a second, harder look at the concept. Biomass absorbs life into weight, right? So it brings together bios and mass, life and weight. And constraining it to formless matter obliterates it in advance of biological extinction, still prior to the actual species and biodiversity loss. At the crest of mass society, a shared social and political phenomenon of bios withers away. Because, to remind you, bios is a particular notion of life for the Greeks, and we have it in biomass. It is the kind of life that is that is presumably more human, that operates in language, that operates with human action. It is the kind of life that is political in Arendt's and Hannah Arendt's also interpretation. And here, not only do we level down plants, landfill gases, manure, sewage, and so on, but we also level down the different kinds of lives, and not only level them, but reduce them to the lowest common denominator. The difference between the highest and the lowest modes of life, between the sociality of bios and the natural, quote-unquote, vitality of zoe, evaporates, with both reduced to, as I have just said, the lowest common denominator, the mechanics of force, gravity, and the fall. Non-nominalist distinctions among life forms, as well as between life and non-life, become irrelevant. Both are presumed lifeless. So in biomass, life itself is extinguished. It is modeled on non-life. Necropolitics, the politics of death, is not at the antipodes of the biopolitics of mass or of the masses. It is one among several consequences of biomassification. Vegetation is at the forefront of biomass. Since Aristotle, its vitality has been linked to a generic mode of living common to plants, animals, and humans, malleable and exuding potentiality in excess of organismic logic. So it's not by chance that plants are featured so prominently in biomass, because they have been figured as a generic mode of life. Plant life reconstructed from the vantage point of reason has been little more than a dump, this generic container, as it were, for living. A combination of bios and mass is a concrete interpretation of vegetal plasticity in compliance with these ancient protocols. Biomass, as I mentioned earlier, is a trash can term. On top of the actual plants, non-vegetal organic waste is hauled into it thanks to the association of muck and the like with the vegetal nutritive faculty, το θρεπτικόν. A deindividuating identification with and as biomass puts us in proximity to plants that here too are at the cutting edge of the latest permutation in the history of being. The point is to transfigure this plight into what elsewhere I have termed a phytocentrism to come, a kind of rallying around plants in this new downtrodden category of biomass. The fate prepared for all life forms is to be biomass, to be reduced to disorganized organic stuff. It is to go up in smoke on the pyre of energy production. The rising fumes of this planetary blaze are a sad parody of matter's negation, suspension, elevation, relief, overcoming, preservation, sublation, and the other senses of Hegel's Aufhebung I might have missed here. The worldwide conflagration turns the sky itself into a dump for carbon emissions and impels the air to visibility, right? As smog, the air too becomes visible. And this is one of the mutations I diagnose in dump philosophy, which is that we have been gradually earthifying the rest of the elements. Water and the air have lost their quality of transparency. We have thrown so much of the byproducts of what has been contained in the earth into water in the shape of plastics and microplastics, which are the byproducts of petroleum, into the air by burning fossil fuels, that all the elements are now gravitating toward a kind of undifferentiated earthiness. The air itself becomes visible. The yellowish-brown hues of nitrogen oxides and the gray pallor sulfur dioxide cast over the areas it affects hand the air over to sight as smog. Ethanol combustion yields carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, not to mention aldehyde, which promotes photochemical reactions. Simply speaking, the air becomes visible as this chemical soup hovering over the world's big cities. Becoming visible, the aerodump reduces visibility and takes our breaths away. And I think that to be faithful to the way the elements appear now, we have to start calling them the geodump, the aerodump, the hydrodump, and no longer water, air, or the earth, because that no longer corresponds to what they are as these mixes of chemicals and so forth. We burn entire crops of sugarcane and corn alive in an a priori thwarted quest for energy, without regard for the living, the dead, and the razor-thin line between them. We burn at the stake the biomass that they are in nothing less than vegetal inquisition. The Middle Ages saw human heretics incinerated on bales of wood and dry straw on the pretext that fire would cleanse their sinful souls as it consumed their bodies. Right? In the Inquisition, fire played a cleansing function according to the logic of the Inquisition itself. It, by consuming the flesh of the sinner, it expiated the sins themselves. Nowadays, the plants themselves are burnt in a secularized drive to atone for their biomassified formlessness by acceding to the only shape that befits matter as mass, and that shape is energy. But plants are not alone in the fumes. No sooner does biomass materialize out of the erstwhile metaphysical perspectives on matter than the partitions between us, who burn something or someone, and them, who are burnt, melt away. We can't simply think that we are subjects burning other objects. We are the incinerated incinerators, the dumpers, inflamed by cinders of a desire opaque to us. And I am biomass, the ephemeral and flammable heaviness of matter still heaving with life, a point of intersection for a living mass and massified living. So what happened toward the end of the 20th century is that we have been seeing the rise of mass production, mass societies, mass media, and mass communications, which I am tempted to call the new four horsemen of the apocalypse. All of these masses jubilantly realizing a complete disconnect between political matter and form. Right? Society is massified, and so what we have is political matter without form. Mass society culminates in mass dissociation. And this is the world of internet existence. This is where the online quasi-life has taken off, in a mass society that has culminated in mass dissociation. To put the masses to work, to draw their energy, suffice it to dump them down to earth, capitalizing on their heaviness, or to incinerate them and dump them up into the sky. A massive throw arrests the political humanization of the masses as it blends them with the rest of the biomass, fueling the furnaces of capital's economy. If we think about a term like human resources are nothing but raw materials, expandable and easily available, formed exclusively outside themselves in a commodity which may be material they help manufacture. Burnt or suffering from a burnout, they are renewable nonetheless, drawn from a never-ending stockpile, together with corn crops, garbage, and excrement. Right? So biomass includes all of these, and I think we have to add this realization to what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life. Right? Bare life, which is a life stripped down to its metabolic or physiological vitality. And so just in conclusion, what happens with this biomassification of humanity is that it advances on two fronts, corresponding to the mutation of bios and the mutation of the masses. Bios, life, comes unglued from a common language and action that, in Hannah Arendt's view, are the preconditions for a new beginning in politics, in political birth, as she calls it. And on the other front, the masses of production, society, media, and communication alienate, isolate, and disarticulate those dropped into and amassed in them. On both fronts, the effects of human biomassification are comparable. Heaps of bodies and thoughts, materials and narrative fragments that are no more than caricaturized types in their isolated traits, objectified labor and lifestyles, those poor substitutes for a form of life. All this accrues fragmented, dismembered, disjointed, atomized, analyzed, but not decomposed. And so, I am biomass, in conclusion, is a speech act that identifies with the vanishing life, that identifies with nothing else but the vanishing life, with life's own vanishing into dumped massiveness. The sentiment and impulse of these words are ineluctable. One must have been dumped by being to resist the dump. We have to move through it in order to try to resist it from within. But what if je suis biomass actually meant to say, I follow biomass? Do I come after it, becoming a survivor and arrogating whatever remains of becoming to myself? Do I merely accompany its trials and tribulations in the newsfeed? Am I fleetingly interested in its fate different from mine, but may switch my attention to something else the next moment? Is there anything or anyone else exempt from the trials and tribulations of biomassification? In the wake of these questions, the gap of indeterminacy in je suis biomasse ought to be sealed. A decision for to be, être, rather than to follow, suivre, is called for. It is necessary, of course, to understand identification with biomass, but more important still, it is vital to feel it in one's bones, those repositories of dioxins, lead, and then radioactive fallout areas of strontium. How does the proximity of I and M to biomass feel? How does it feel for I and to be M to be close to biomass? From the point of view of the identifying subject, it is no different from the experience of falling into a black hole in an interminable approach to the event horizon that appears to be ahead of the one who has already crossed the threshold. So to say je suis biomasse, I am biomass, is to drop into a black hole from the standpoint of this subject of identification. The affirmation says, I am decimated being and stymied becoming, yet not exactly nothing. Dumped, I resist the dump with the surreal power of not nothing. Thank you.